So in a few minutes, we're going to get to Barack Obama's endorsement of Joe Biden and where we stand. But first, we're going to talk about something that we'll talk about with Paul O'Connell, which are these devastating leaks coming out of the UK showing a relentless campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and the left of Labour inside the Labour Party itself. Now, in some respects, this is not a surprise. This is sort of analogous. Would it surprise anyone if we found out that Democratic Party officials were coordinating with some MSNBC hosts to demonize Bernie Sanders, to smear and defame his supporters? We saw it play out in front of us every day during this cycle. And we knew that the war against Jeremy Corbyn was not only a prototype for the war against Bernie Sanders, but that it included aggressive PR efforts, relentless media bias, and the active engagement, in my view, undoubtedly, of at least some intelligence services. But we found out some stunning things, like the hype about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was, of course, where it was actually real, selectively applied, not really a good faith effort to deal with what actual anti-Semitism there was, which manifested across party sort of factions in very small ways. Apparently, the complaints about anti-Semitism, half of which came from one singular individual. And we also saw from these messages that in 2017, an extraordinary run that Jeremy Corbyn became within a couple thousand votes of winning on an incredibly brave policy platform and extraordinary grassroots enthusiasm, a campaign that would be saving countless lives right now if there was a Corbyn government, and might have had global implications for reviving social democracy and overturning neoliberalism and authoritarianism. That the Labour right was literally inside the campaigns itself, actively undermining Corbyn and the grassroots' efforts, and in full view, trying to make their own side lose. Leaked WhatsApp conversations, and these are thanks to the incredible reporting of Aaron Bastani and Navarra Media. Leaked WhatsApp messages show that members of Labour's senior management team were openly cheering for Labour's losses and were prepping Tom Watson, then Jeremy Corbyn's deputy, to be the interim leader. This group of Labour officials created, quote, secret key seat teams without the knowledge of Corbyn. It funneled money to key members of the anti-Corbyn faction, most of them in safe districts instead of competitive races. As Labour rose in the polls, members of this WhatsApp group were appalled at their party's own success. I actually felt quite sick when I saw that YouGov poll last night, one said. Labour's head of political strategy called Corbyn a lying little toe rag. And of course, they mocked Diane Abbott, who was subject to racist and sexist abuse. They even went so far as to hoping that the police would shut down a major rally before the election, with one of the members hoping that the police would, quote, use water cannons, please. What went into the campaign to the, and this was not just them being despicable sociopaths. This, again, was very material. Key data from party members and those working with Corbyn from key were withheld. Insights could have helped guide Corbyn to the additional 2,277 votes that would have made the difference in Labour forming a government. It worked to direct funds to anti-Corbyn seats, even though they were safe, as I mentioned earlier, and showed up to work and deliberately did nothing. Maybe the only way in which they were respecting any sort of honorable Labour tradition. But all jokes aside, this really reveals the absolute rot at the core of the leadership of the Labour Party, even during the Corbyn era. We can have no doubt that if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, that the same dynamics would be in play with the Democratic Party. This, though, is an escalation, to be clear. Bernie Sanders was never able to win a nomination, and though, of course, there were institutional biases against him. And I have no doubt the same dynamic would have played out with senior Democrats actively trying to make Sanders lose. The fact that this actually did happen in the case of Labour in the UK is a significant escalation and reveals the absolute rot at the center of American politics. Most liberals, most in the center, sadly, would prefer a right-wing government to an authentic left-wing government. This is proven definitively, at least in the case of these revelations. Our opposition is deep-rooted institutionally. A democratic version of these leaks would be just as damning. And we cannot treat institutions as neutral, just as the left needs to be far more forgiving, relaxed, tolerant, infinitely less puritanical in its own dealings. It needs to apply somewhat of the friend-enemy distinction in politics and ruthlessly sideline its enemies and campaign properly from the beginning. We saw echoes of this. Bernie Sanders and the left media in general handing Elizabeth Warren's poisonous at worst and useless at best campaign with kid gloves, culminating in the heartbreaking reveal that Bernie Sanders was personally hurt by her lack of endorsement because, of course, as we all know, he obviously would have done the same for her. The campaign from the beginning not going hard at Joe Biden, talking about the innate risk propositions of his candidacy and correctly assessing the political field that the race was a contest fundamentally between Biden and Sanders. And of course, we also see this in the enormous efforts that President Obama did behind the scenes to coordinate the party in a ruthless display of power to block Sanders and the movement towards human decency in this country. We need to be real, and that is why phrases like ruthless actually needs to be deployed strategically and thoughtfully moving forward. Corbyn was under siege on all sides, a good man trying to implement a good agenda that would have saved countless lives in a crisis and improved many more day in and day out. Him and McDonald took extraordinary risks and did a lot for global democracy. However, he wasn't willing and probably not able to make the exact moves he needed to clean out the Labor Party, fire these folks, and clean out his opposition. Now, of course, during all of this time, part of the endless bleeding and whining from the centrists and the right of the Labor Party was that Corbyn ran some type of Stalinist cabal. Well, if only it were so. Labor's new leader, Keir Starmer, which we'll talk about later, has responded to these leaks, but has focused primarily on the fact of them being leaked, not the despicable nature of their revelations. He's not on the right of Labor, but he certainly is on the soft left and has not proven himself at all as of yet up to the task of aggressively challenging the Tory government or making accountable the obscene people that undermined a unique and essential opportunity for the UK in 2017 and the globe as a whole. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Just that, I just think we really need to highlight the fact that we can't treat these institutions as neutral. We need to have a kind of Machiavellian understanding and a class understanding that specifically the Labor Party has been captured for the most part, especially in the leadership, the high-ranking officials, by people who are very hostile to our politics. And I think it's the same situation in the United States as well, obviously, with the Democratic Party. And if we think that, symbolic victories are just winning the election is the end of politics, then we're always going to lose because a lot of politics is actually done behind the scenes. And sadly, we're seeing that, in these really frustrating labor leaks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just second that. I think this moment should be clarifying, and this primary, I think in general, that you can't really trust a lot of these people, and that these institutions are going to be much more closed to you than you thought they were, and we just need to be real about the battle it's gonna take there. That's the whole thing. Not to keep making this about the presidential election, but with Warren and Sanders, right? Warren played supposedly this this role that the inside game, right? She's a progressive that actually works with people, and obviously she got nowhere because that's not a real thing that exists. We're going to need to actually force these institutions to change. We're not going to be able to persuade them to.
Right. And of course, her actual only function was as a wrecker. And I think what also frustrates me, and I'll actually give more latitude because I think Labor was, I think Corbyn and McDonald and that faction, they could have done more, but they were running up against some very real limits. The war against them was so relentless, and from everything from the Israel lobby to the entirety of the UK press. Now, that is true with Sanders, but there was, the reason the lesson with Warren is so important is just like out of the gate, people just wrap themselves into pretzels to overthink something that's obvious, which is that two people are competing against each other. And they're competing against each other for votes in a zero-sum game, actually. And so spinning out all of these scenarios, it's not just that they're wrong. Like, of course, Warren's not going to team up with Bob Sanders and give him her delegates or whatever. I mean, again, tragically, Sanders would probably do that for her, but she's not going to do that for him. And then the other thing is that, like, if the conditions of the race led to something like that happening, it would just happen. It would not be like a fantasy that was conjured from the beginning. It would be the process of a political conflict, a political battle. And so I just think all of these things, just point to, again, just that Machiavellian need, that serious need to look at power. And it really, frankly, has very little to do with, like, I see some pushback of sometimes people who say, like, well, but when you're working in institutions, you have to, like, you can't just always go at people or whatever. And first of all, that's 100% true. Of course not. And one of the paradoxes, and things we're synthesizing in this show is that, again, the left needs to be infinitely more appealing, infinitely more forgiving, infinitely more adaptable, infinitely more in touch with people's lives, without a doubt. And at the same time, some of that resistance you hear is, well, yes, that's true if your concern is getting future consulting contracts, or not building, or not burning bridges, or not having uncomfortable debates. I will totally say, and I think this show is very clear in the whole Warren regard from the beginning. And I also think there's value to diplomacy and strategy, constantly banging on that point. But you can see this, like, I stand 100% by my critiques of Yang, Gabbard, and Warren. 100%. Sorry if that upsets anybody. I would refine some of them a little bit, but basically I stand by those critiques. But there was, the social capital of Warren supporters made doing that different. And that's what people are talking about. And that isn't having institutional insight. That's just you not wanting to deal with conflict and stressful conversations, because the truth is you need to compete. Warren needed to be taken out from the beginning. It was a fucking ridiculous, embarrassing waste of time. And this was a really serious election.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.